Time to begin.
Hey y'all, my name is Madelyn Montgomery and this is my partner Abigail Reed. And first we just want to thank you for allowing us to come and present our exhibition with you today. It's titled Quilting, the Alabama Women's Free Speech. We did this exhibition as a project for Dr. Mary Springer's American Art in the Old South class last semester. And for this project we were tasked with curating an exhibition on the topic of our choosing in the broad spectrum of American art. We decided to focus on the history of quilting, and upon further research, we decided to narrow that focus to the history of quilting in Alabama from the time frame of 1849 to 1949. We also decided to narrow our focus on the aspect of how quilting affected the women that created these quilts, and in turn, how these women affected quilting and how they used it as a means of expressing themselves. We imagine this exhibition to be a four-walled experience, as you can see here, and we'll be your curators as we guide you through the museum. So with that being said, we would like to welcome you to our exhibit.
The first quilt we're going to show you is an example of a lower class block quilt, and most lower class quilts were made by small subsistence farmers or factory workers. And this is an example of that. It was made by Mary Ann Rouse Thomas. And a block quilt was basically a quilt made up of small pieces of fabric or blocks of cloth and sewn together. And it was convenient for poorer women because it allowed them to use cloth that they had already. And it allowed them to make it over longer periods of time, which was convenient for them to be able to divide up their time over farm chores and then factory time. And something that was distinct amongst lower class quilts was the stitching. The stitching was loose because it allowed for more cotton batting, and cotton batting was important for insulation. It allowed a quilt to be warmer. And batting is the layer between the top and the bottom, or the front and the back of the quilt. It gives good insulation. You can see here the image on the right has cotton batting, and the image on the left has very little or none. And the image that accompanies the quilt is one of the Thomas family. I apologize for the quality of it. This was the best scan I could get. But why I felt this was necessary to show is an image from the late 1800s would have been rare for lower class families to get. So when they were going to get one, it would be important to show, prized possessions. And you can see they have their quilts in the back on the porch. And so by them having that there was a statement saying that it was an important possession to them to have their quilts in the image. Block quilting wasn't only for poor women or lower class families. It was also done by wealthier women. But the distinct difference between this quilt and the previous one is the purpose of it. Wealthier women made quilts out of, they made it for decorative reasons. It was a way to show their skills and the materials they could afford. A lot of times they had really nice colors and expensive dyes. So it was a way to showcase what their class setting was. What was another big part about block quilts during this time was there were so many different styles made, and those styles were often made in reference to a political event. This one, made by the Turk sisters, was actually copied another design called Whig's Defeat, and that was in reference to the 1844 presidential election when James Polk defeated the Whig candidate Henry Clay. So block quilt designs like this were a way for them to make references to events and show their views during a time when they weren't allowed to vote and often not allowed to express their opinions.
The equality of block quilting, its accessibility to all people, is what makes it truly American. However, we see the irony in that statement as we look at many upper-class examples, such as this Star of Bethlehem quilt. Miss Elizabeth North Clark quilted this in 1849, and she was from Monroe, Alabama, and she was 19 at the age of creating this quilt top. She pieced it in the traditional Star of Bethlehem pattern, which consisted of small diamond shapes cut and arranged to resemble an 8-point star radiating from the center. Amy Osaki says in her article, A Truly Feminine Employment, that this was a way that women proved themselves in society and essentially found a husband. We know that Miss Clark was from an upper-class family because she used whole cloth quilting, which meant that that white piece in the back was a single piece of fabric, which would have been more expensive than piecing the fabric, all of it together. And we also know that she was from an upper-class family because she used a separate binding, which is the piece that goes around the edge. Lower-class women would have taken the back of the quilt and folded it over to the front to create the binding. We also know that she was unmarried when she created this quilt. Therefore, it would have been imperative to her to have only the best needlework in her quilt. So because of that, when she created the quilt top, she sent it off to a slave named Miss Peggy, who was renowned to be the best needleworker in the county. Miss Peggy quilted the quilt top to the quilt back, using intricate stitching patterns of eagles and foils, such as this example here. And because of this, we see that though quilting was one area in which the mistress of the household or the woman of the upper class home would have participated in quilting, we also see, because of documentation such as this, that slaves also participated in the task. And unfortunately, in this way, quilting became a representation of who the ideal female was, whether slave or free, and what skills she possessed, and in turn, how desirable she was to society. Racial tensions eventually led to the Civil War, during which time quilting became a means for women to contribute to the war effort. They relearned their skills in textile production because textile mills would have been above southern lines. And in doing that, they produced clothes and covers for their men in the front. And they also produced more intricate quilts that they called gunboat quilts to raise money for an iron battleship for the war effort. After the war, the South's economy was in shambles. However, eventually the Industrial Revolution hit, and the production of quilt making skyrocketed because of the invention of things such as synthetic aniline dyes, which would have allowed them to create more colors in their textiles, as well as the invention of the sewing machine. Robert Shaw says in his book, American Quilts, that the last 3 decades of the 19th and first decade of the 20th century comprise the greatest era in quilt making in American history.
And as Madelyn was saying, African American women did contribute to quilting during slavery and often didn't get credit. But after the Civil War, they were able to show their own designs and creative expression through quilting. And one such community is in Gee's Bend, which is in Boykin, Alabama. And this is an example of a quilt made from Gee's Bend. It was made in 1950 by Pearlie Irving Petway. And something that's very significant about Gee's Bend is the fact that it is still an active quilting community. And it has a very rich history in Alabama quilting because of how important it was to the economic life of African Americans in Gee's Bend. During the Civil Rights Movement, African American women in Gee's Bend and surrounding communities created a Freedom Quilting Bee, which allowed them to raise funds for the Civil Rights Movement and also
for bettering the lifestyle that they had. The image that I have with it is not of Petway, but it is of an African-American woman and her daughters creating a quilt. And it was such an important tradition to pass down to their children. And it was often done, together and in community. So it was a very family-oriented project. And so I felt this was important to show because it was a piece of history. And to finish that up, I think that, the quilting at G's Bend was very important to Alabama quilting history. And because it's still an active quilting community, though not as much as it once was, it has probably deeper roots than some of the other quilting communities in Alabama.
So for this next quilt, I'm going to ask you to come up to the front and look at the quilt with us over here. So by the 1940s, sewing had eventually died out because of the rampant industrial production of things such as bedspreads and clothes. The only exception to this rule lied in the still rural communities of America, such as in this quilt. This is a family heirloom quilt. It was created by my great-grandmother. Her name was Miss Katie B. Dunn. She was married to a cotton farmer from rural Eden, Alabama, and she created this quilt in 1949. So Miss Katie was a hard worker. She was quite a character. And so she made this quilt all on her own. She picked the cotton batting from her husband's field by hand. She gathered scraps from her other sewing projects to use to create the quilt in a cheaper manner. And she even used chicken feed sacks in some of the fabrics of the quilt. Once she had gathered all of her materials, she would sew the quilt top on the sewing machine at her home, and then she would take it to the local quilting bee in the community. So the women of the community would meet up on this lady named Miss Gracie Beck's front porch. And on her porch, she would have this wooden quilting frame made out of 2x4s. And it would be on the ceiling, and they would lower it down on a pulley system. And then they would put the quilt top and the batting and the quilt back into the frame. And all of the women would sit around and they would just hand sew for hours on the quilt. And during this time, they would teach their daughters how to sew, so it was a time of family bonding, but it was also a time of community bonding. In an otherwise isolated and busy farm community, this was a way for these women to connect and to really share what was happening in their lives. So the woman's voice was oftentimes muddled throughout Alabama history. However, by experiencing this exhibition and looking back at these beautiful quilts these Alabama women created, we hope that you as visitors begin to hear their voices speak loud and clear. These women took the oftentimes mundane task of creating quilts for their families, and they made it into an art form uniquely their own. So as you look at the quilts hanging on the walls of our exhibit, that are passed down from generation to generation, we hope that you value them now more than ever as testaments to the ingenuity, wisdom, and creativity